Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing remarkably well. I'm doing great, thank you very much. And I'm so thrilled you've joined me today because I've got a lovely story for you. This is part 2 of our story. So if you haven't heard part 1, go back to the story that we put up online last night and we'll continue with our story now. So before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up. And let's continue with part 2 of our story. "Let's drink a toast to Emily," says her aunt, opening a bottle of champagne. The cork pops and glasses of white foaming effervescent bubbly are poured out into fluted champagne glasses and offered around. "To Emily," they all say, raising their glasses up to toast her. "Welcome to America and to our humble little home." "Thanks," Emily laughs. "I'm so glad to be here. I really am. And to finally meet you all. I've waited such a long time for this. Let me tell you, Emily, I'm so thrilled to have you staying here on our ranch with us. So are the boys, and so is my husband. For one thing, I will not be the only woman on this ranch. You may not have noticed this, but everything on our ranch is male. Our 2 cats are male, our Labradors are male, our steers are male, and our American quarter horses are male. So you could say there is way too much testosterone around here. This place is begging for a boost of estrogen, and finally we have some. I couldn't be happier about that. I won't be so overshadowed from now on." "To estrogen," says Harry, giving Emily a wink. "We could do with some of that around here. Mother's absolutely right. There is far too much testosterone around here. We need the softer female touch." By all accounts, Emily soon settled down to life at the ranch very comfortably in the Carmichael household. It would seem her maniacal inhibitions and constrained awkwardness had all but melted away. She became reposefully comfortable with her cousins. They rode quad bikes around the countryside, cycled and rode horses, and they also enjoyed hiking together. Without a doubt, the languid fresh air and the insouciant, mellow and carefree southern hospitality made Emily feel as if she'd really belonged on the ranch, and after a week she certainly felt as if she'd known her cousins all her life. She was particularly fond of Harry, as he had such an engaging sense of humour. It was on the Friday morning of her 2nd week staying at the ranch that Emma firmly decided she was going to ask her cousins if they knew anything about why her father had fallen out with their dad. She felt complacent enough with them to now ask them any impertinent questions that only a week before she would have been reticent to even dare broach. It felt like her 2 cousins had become to her like brothers. She delighted in the fact that Harry was affectionately already calling her sis. It would seem Crow was right. He had warned her that her father's brother was very quiet and unassuming. He wasn't wrong about that. When Emma watched Crow and her uncle out there on the fields together, riding their horses behind the steers, she marvelled at what a natural rancher her uncle was, and Crow was also very impressive on horseback. It was on a Friday morning, after her 2nd week staying at the ranch, that Emily had firmly decided she was going to ask her cousins if they knew anything about why her father had fallen out with their dad. She felt complacent enough with them now to ask them any impertinent questions that only a week prior she would have been reticent to even dare broach. It felt like her 2 cousins had become to her like brothers. She delighted in the fact that Harry was affectionately already calling her sis. It would seem Crow was right. He'd warned her that her father's brother was a very quiet, unassuming man, and he wasn't wrong about that. Emily was mesmerised when Crow and her uncle were out there on the fields, on the back of their horses, riding behind the steers. She marvelled at what a natural rancher her uncle was, and Crow was also exceedingly impressive on horseback. The quintessential Colorado cowboys, she thought proudly to herself. It was later that morning that Emily was riding on an American quarterback horse herself called Dancing King, who had acquired his illustrious, highly esteemed name from his incredulous, elegant gait. Let's just say when he trotted, he looked like he was dancing, and Harry said he should have been born a Lipizzaner pony, as those show horses have incredible grace. Emily agreed. She'd never seen a horse move with such a graceful poise. It was a magnificently beautiful day. The sky was a cup of blue, without even a candy cotton cloud in sight. It was like the day had decided to be fine and sunny, and had audaciously dictated its will across the countryside. The kingly carpet of fragrant flowers bounced happily through the grass, while the needled boughs of the leggy alpine trees seemed to hungrily soak in the sunshine, like kids guzzling the last remnants of chocolate milk through a straw. Emily smiled contentedly to herself as the warm sunny rays streamed across her shoulders, and a gutsy cool breeze blew against her skin. She felt invigorated, no longer like a strange, awkward English girl from London, but like the quintessential American cowgirl. Well, at least she hoped she did. It was only her English accent that gave the game away, but if she kept her mouth tightly shut, that could be easily remedied. She had been given a tan, very stunning cowboy hat from her Aunt Ruth as a present, along with some matching boots. So riding on the back of her black horse, whose coat gleamed with sweat, felt to her almost like a déjà vu event, almost as if in some other lifetime she had belonged out here in the Colorado mountains. Even her cousins had been quick to remark at what a natural she was on horseback. They no longer felt they needed to make special allowances for an ungainly beginner, so galloping over fields had been a given for all three of them, which meant riding at breakneck speed against the wind had been a thrill of note. "You are kidding, are you not, Emily?" Harry had challenged her obsequiously. "Come on, you've ridden a horse before. You're having us on. Don't give me all this stuff and nonsense about never having ridden before. I don't buy that for a minute. You knew immediately what you were doing when you were holding the reins, and the way you are seated on the saddle looks like you've been riding since you were 2 years old. I've never seen a beginner sit so comfortably on a horse before." "I don't care if you don't buy it, Harry. I'm telling you, I've never ridden before. I live in London, for goodness sake. When would I find the opportunity to go riding? With the exception of the holidays, of course, but we never go horseback riding on any of those holidays. And we haven't done it once. So no, I've never been riding before." The three cousins happily rode their horses with an unbridled ebullience, where laughter tumbled in the meadows and flowers smiled at them through the knee-high grass. The horses steadily trotted through a long, open, rugged earthen trail, in between the congregation of towering trees, where a sneaky, inquisitive blue sky would sometimes peek at them through the open canopy. The wood grove was furnished with a verdant underbrush and a plethora of lacy ferns. The horses finally exited the trees to arrive at a small grass clearing, where a stream of fast-moving water cascaded across the rocks. The white water sprayed their faces with a cooling mist. They dismounted their horses, leaving them to graze, while they sat by the stream, watching the water thundering over the rocks. It was incredibly relaxing and cathartic. Emily got the distinct feeling that something or someone was watching them from the trees, but both her cousins, who were so intent on throwing the rocks into the water, seemed otherwise engaged and preoccupied. They were seeing which one of them could throw their rock with the lowest splash and the neatest plunge. "You're useless," says Harry to his brother. "That rock went down like a machine. I'll show you how it's done," he says, skimming his rock across the water. "See there," he said proudly. "No splash. It went down perfectly." "I admit that was good," says Joseph, "but I bet I can do better than that." Emma felt she'd imagined that they'd been watched. I mean, if they really were being watched, her astute cousins would surely have noticed. They were so connected to the natural world. Emily did observe that the horses who were swishing their tails had stopped eating and were staring at the woodgrove, but they seemed unfazed and very happy, so Emily thought there was nothing to worry about, and turned her attention directly towards her cousins. "Tell me," she says, throwing a rock into the water, "do you know why my father and your dad don't talk? They're brothers. They haven't said a single word to each other in years. Don't you think that is super weird? My father just shuts down every time I ask him questions about his old life here." She pauses for a brief moment. "Let's just say getting anything out of him is like extracting blood from a stone. My mother married him like this, closed up like a barnacle. falsely believing that one day he'd talk, but he never did. I mean, what could be so bad it would tear a family apart? So two brothers don't speak to each other for years. My father didn't want me to come to America. He probably knew I'd start investigating and asking impertinent questions. But I need to know why they fell out. As underneath it all, I know my father is deeply hurting, and I imagine yours is too. We owe it to our family to fix this rift, don't you think?
Sorry, Emma. I'm as clueless as you, says Joseph, shrugging his shoulders. I've asked my father on numerous occasions why we don't know our English relatives well. He always uses the distance between England and America as a lame excuse. What about you, Harry? Do you know any dark secrets about our family that I'm not privy to?
Actually, I do, says Harry. Believe it or not, I happen to know that our fathers were incredibly close when they were young boys, until they got into their 20s. Then everything went awry.
Why the hell didn't you tell me any of this? Asked Joseph, looking nonplussed.
It was clear that the two brothers kept no secrets from each other. So discovering that his brother was sitting on a sliver of information that he was not privy to, left Joseph feeling more than a little miffed, but he tried to maintain a calm demeanour, although Emily noticed his jaw tightening.
Because I was eavesdropping, that's why. I shouldn't have been listening in to a conversation. I knew it wasn't my secret to tell. But Emily's right. We need to fix this mess. So I'm going to tell you what I know. It's about time, bro. It's about time.
Harry's account.
It was the day after Easter. I was paying a big price for that, let me tell you. I was 12 years old at the time. I remember the day vividly. I woke up with a pounding headache. I never normally have headaches, but my head was throbbing violently. It really was bad. I had eaten a lot of chocolate that day. And, well, chocolate hasn't always agreed with me. I often get headaches from chocolate or too much orange juice. That also has a similar effect on me. My mother has exactly the same problem, I hasten to say. I guess I must have inherited it from her. I decided to go and find her, ask her for some migraine medication to quell the pain. I discovered Mum and Dad were not in their bedrooms as I would have expected. I heard a chatting sound coming from the living room, so I guessed the parents were up talking in there, probably over a glass of wine or something. I was just about to barge into the living room to whine about my headache and extract the maximum amount of sympathy from my mother, when I overheard her saying,
"I wish to God you would tell me what happened between you and your brother all those years ago. How can I possibly help you if you keep shutting me down like this? I'm your wife, for goodness sake. Don't I deserve to know what happened between the both of you? I'll never disclose your secret to anyone. You know I won't. I've always got your back."
At this point, my ears are flapping. I almost forget about my headache. My mother is the only one that can get my father to talk about anything. So I was hankering to know the answer to this enigmatic question. Why were we not in touch with his brother's side of the family? "Don't you understand? I can't talk about this. It's very upsetting. It's very distressing for me. It opens up old wounds. It really hurts when I talk about these kind of things."
"I can see what happened between you and your brother has eaten you alive for years. I cannot just sit back and see you punishing yourself like this with such a lugubrious melancholia. Sometimes the plaster needs to be ripped off the wound so that it gets aired and can heal more efficiently. Keeping everything buried away in secret is going to make that wound fester all the more. It's not healthy to dwell on a secret, you know. A trouble shared is a trouble halved. I'm your wife. I can help you. Tell me, for goodness sake."
"Well, in truth, sweetheart, I honestly don't know where to start. It's quite a story," said my father ruefully.
"Well, how about at the very beginning? In my experience, that's the best place to start."
As you can imagine, I was about to hear a family secret, so I pinned my ears to the door and listened in. I was so scared my parents would hear me. My heart was pounding violently in my chest. It sounded like my mother had cracked the egg and was about to spill its contents, and like a scavenger, I was ready to pounce on that yolk of information. My father continued, Very well, I will tell you, if it'll get you off my back. Well, let me just see, where shall I start? My older brother Paul, he was working in Oxford in England as an attorney, after he'd written a final examination with the Law Society. His work included drafting legal documents, negotiating settlements and disputes, preparing cases for presentations in court, that sort of stuff.
So he didn't want to be a rancher like you, then? Why not?
It wasn't that he didn't want to be a rancher. He loved being out here on the ranch. But he had firmly decided that acquiring a law degree as a backup plan was a sagacious thing to do. Paul was very savvy like that. He always thought that it was important to have 2 or 3 skill sets that you could always fall back on in life, rather like a backup copy in a computer, should things go wrong. I, on the other hand, could not have imagined anything else for my life than being a rancher. Paul was exceedingly bright. It made sense that he would get involved with the law. But I was very surprised when he devoted the rest of his life to the legal profession, I have to admit, as in truth I'd always known him to be a very outdoorsy type of person.
But why on earth did he go to England in the first place to study law? Why not here in America?
He was very young at the time. He wanted an exciting new adventure. He was accepted to Oxford University in England, so he was hardly going to turn that opportunity down. He fancied living for a few years in another country, but I never believed he'd choose to stay in England indefinitely. Of course, he kept coming back to the ranch. He loved it here. Colorado was his home. We thought he'd become a full-time rancher, leave all that legal stuff behind him. He certainly said he hated the law, wanted to move back to the ranch at once. Mum had been on dialysis for her kidney for over 7 years, but she suddenly began to get very ill. Her feeble, fragile, frail body had simply had enough. It was shutting down and becoming significantly weaker, so she needed an urgent kidney as soon as possible, so she was put on a kidney transplant list. But no suitable match had been found from any deceased or living donor, so in effect my poor mother was living on borrowed time. We were all checked to see if any one of us was a suitable match. It turned out that Paul was perfect. He was most insistent that he wanted to give our mother a kidney. My mother was very grateful about his generous offer, but we all knew Paul was in effect saving our mother's lives. We felt indebted to him. Paul assured my father that it would be an honour to help my mother by donating a kidney. On the day of the kidney operation, an hour before it was supposed to commence, he left a note on his hospital bed. He abandoned the hospital. The note said, "I'm sorry, I just can't do this. I just can't." The next thing I knew, he'd taken the first flight back to England, where he began working for an illustrious law firm. We never heard from him for a very long time, but my mother soon passed away. My brother had failed to give her a kidney. If he had donated his kidney to her, she could have lived a long, full life. My father was livid, furious with my brother. So was I. Our hopes had been dashed. He had retracted his promise to my mother. When he turned up for her funeral, he looked bashful and very distraught about her death. My father said to him, "Why did you bother to come to the funeral? We wouldn't be in this dreadful pickle if you had been courageous enough to do the decent thing for your mother, instead of running away to a burrow like a frightened rabbit and failing to even get in touch. You're a coward, son. I'm ashamed to call you my son. Your mother's blood is on your hands. You promised to give her a kidney, and in destroying her life by relinquishing your promises, you've destroyed our lives. I never want to see you again." I also gave him hell, I hasten to say. I wish it had been me with the kidney, because I would have not failed this family, I told him. "You're a wuss. Why don't you go back to England and rot in hell? I never want to see you again as long as I live. You're my older brother, but I have more respect for a snail than you." I said some brutally unkind things that I possibly should not have said. I didn't understand why my brother, who promised my mother his kidney, had done such a dreadful thing. Now we were without our mother. I couldn't get my head around that fact. He could have saved her life, but he didn't. As you can imagine, my mother Ruth was very silent for a moment when she was digesting the full horror of what my father was telling her.
I don't know what to say. I wasn't expecting you to tell me this. I thought you were going to say you both fell for the same girl or something. But this I did not expect. Did your brother ever explain why he ran away from the hospital like that on the day of the transplant? It sounds to me he was terrified of giving his kidney away. Surely he should have had some counselling for that.
I think he must have just freaked out, panicked at the very last minute, rather like a deer caught in headlights. Even so, I fail to comprehend why he never went through with the operation, regardless of his misgivings. I mean, when you love someone so dreadfully, even if you have to make a big sacrifice for them, you do it, don't you? Even if it hurts you. I mean, we would lay our lives down in a heartbeat for our children. So why couldn't he have helped my mother?
Of course we would. And in the same circumstances, if my mother needed a kidney, I wouldn't hesitate to give her one either. But you must remember this, we're all completely different. Fear can be very disabling. Maybe at the very last minute, he just got so frightened. How did your mother react when she realised she wasn't getting a kidney from him? That must have come as a cold slap in the face for her.
Well, she blamed herself, didn't she? She should have refused his offer for a kidney, that's what she said. Then nothing like this would have happened. She said her son was too young to have been expected to do something so life-changing, and we were expecting far too much from him. I mean, of course he did have counselling. The doctors asked him if he was absolutely certain about the donation, and that he was allowed to say no. But he said he was eager to give my mother a kidney, and he had no doubts that this is what he wanted to do.
Well, maybe at the time he really meant it, until the day of the operation. How do you feel about your brother now? Do you still hate him for what he did? Or have you forgiven him?
Of course I've forgiven him. Do you have any idea how expensive hatred is? And I mean that quite literally eats away at you. It's like a cancer, isn't it? Me and my dad, a year after Mum died, we wanted to mend the rift with Paul. We rarely did. We sent numerous letters to him, apologising, asking if we could put the past behind us, and that we were sorry about putting pressure on him over the kidney. Paul sent all our letters back in a white envelope, unopened. So when Dad died, he begged me to reconcile with him. But I've tried and tried to no avail. I really miss him, you know. He's the only family I've really got left. We were the best of friends. But how do you fix a gaping wound like this? It's impossible. The gap now between us is far too wide.
After Harry's stunning, disquieting revelation, both Emily and Joseph stare at him gobsmacked. "Bloody hell," says Emily. "I knew they'd fallen out. But this I never envisaged. It's so desperately sad. It grieves my heart. No wonder my father never talks about his family. I imagine he feels so ashamed that he let everyone down and caused his mother's death. I mean, all these years he's been carrying around the burden of an insufferable guilt, which is why he got so cocooned in his life as an attorney in London, and cut out the American part of his life like a sewing pattern, which he promptly discarded. Beyond that, he has to live with the guilt of having not saved his mother's life. It's a huge burden to carry."
"It's tough," agreed Joseph, "but I promise you this, Emily. If you needed my kidney, I wouldn't hesitate to donate it to you. It wouldn't be a problem for me."
"So you think my dad's a coward? Go on, say it then."
"No, I'm not saying that. Think about it. It's a hell of a sacrifice giving a part of yourself to someone. I mean, maybe your dad had an all-consuming fear. It swallowed him whole. I think I can understand that."
"Well, maybe back then my father was a shrinking violet. I don't know what his problem was. But I can promise you this. If I needed a kidney today, I know my father wouldn't hesitate to give it to me. So I guess he was young, naive, fearful back then. I don't think we should judge him on past mistakes. But I think we need to do something to bring those brothers back together again. I'm sure our grandparents from beyond the grave would be begging us to do something about this dilemma. We have to do something."
"But what can we do?" asked Harry. "I think they will go to their graves never having reconciled. It seems like a dreadful pity."
"Leave it to me," says Emily. "I'm going to fix this problem. If it's over my dead body, see if I don't. Look at the both of you. You're so cynical, so doubting, so scathing. Goodness gracious, have a little faith in me, won't you? I'm good at brainstorming. I'll come up with a magnificent idea. See if I don't." "Well, good luck with that, Emily. You're going to need it," says Harry, giving her a big affectionate hug. "I'm not sure how we could possibly bring those two together, but if anyone can do it, it's you. Now let's get back to the house, shall we?" That evening when Emily went back to bed, she tossed and turned in her bedsheets. All she could think about was her father, and how fearful he must have been about donating a kidney. He had been so terrified he'd actually run away from his hospital bed, flying directly back to England. It seemed like he'd wanted to do the right thing by his mother. But at the end of the day, he just couldn't do it. He must have felt like he'd rarely failed his mother. It would be easy to judge her father, Emily thought, describe him as selfish and mean. But Emily had never encountered a frugal, self-centred side to her father's character before. He was one of the most generous men she knew. She reflected back to a time she and a couple of her friends were going on a bungee jumping adventure in the English countryside. She had been so excited about the expedition, but when it came to her turn to jump, despite all the protective harnesses, Emily just couldn't do it. She had become paralysed by a crippling fear and had experienced a panic attack so dreadfully bad she thought her heart was going to explode through her chest. She rarely felt she was about to die, but the EMT had assured her she'd experienced a panic attack and advised her against ever attempting to do the jump. Emily did not need any further persuasion from the EMTs. She would never ever attempt to bungee jump again. No, never. Yes, people might think she was a scaredy cat, but she didn't care. They had no comprehension of the overwhelming fear that had crippled her so profusely and intimidated her courage. Could her father possibly have experienced an oppressive, daunting fear like that? So excruciatingly bad, so insufferable, that even though his heart wanted to do the right thing by his own mother, when push came to shove, he couldn't do it. She pondered over these many things as she lay propped up against her pillow, and a lonely tear spilled down her cheeks as she wallowed in her father's anguish. How much she loved him, how she wanted to fix this problem. She could not imagine how long her poor father had lived with this compounding guilt. Sleep that night abandoned her. The night hung limply onto every minute and every second, as if refusing to let go of the time. The clock on her nightstand seemed rigidly stiff, almost as if the hands had been held back with superglue. Emily's spirit grew restless. She tossed and turned in her bed, failing to find a comfortable sleeping position for herself. Perspiration poured down her back, and her fingers involuntarily began to twitch, until she could bear it no more. I can't just lie here in my bedroom, staring into space. So Emily promptly decided that she needed to get up and move about. My head will explode with bored frustration if I don't. Then she had a great idea. She'd go for a walk in the countryside. Yes, it was dark out there, but it would be fun. She had seen a torch on the hallway table, and she had a strong pair of walking boots with her. One night in London, when she failed to get any sleep, she'd slipped out of bed and walked down the vibey streets, where some people were up and about. She had returned home feeling so much better. When she climbed into bed, she had slept like a baby that night. This would be no different, but instead of people and bright city lights for company, she would be serenaded by the trees and the crickets, and then maybe, when she returned back to her bed, her mind would be clearer and more coherent, and she'd finally get some sleep. Emily wasted no time. She needed little encouragement in climbing out of bed. She hurriedly got dressed into jeans, a sweater and walking boots. She did so discreetly. The hushed house was steeped in a soundless, subdued silence. She crept cautiously past the half-open doors of both of her cousins' bedrooms and her uncle and aunt's bedroom, where she could hear two Labradors snoring loudly as they slept at the basket at the foot of their bed. They were dead to the world after having burnt all their energy running around the meadows all day. She clandestinely climbed down the sweeping staircase with the stealth of a cheetah, although she did manage to make it creak ever so slightly, but that could not be helped. It was a very old staircase after all. The light in the landing was on, so she could see her way clearly. She found the torch, and she surreptitiously opened the back door to the kitchen, closing it gently behind her. She wouldn't bother to lock it, as crime was not a problem in this part of the world. Emily found herself caught up in the strangeness of a dark night, which was not a common occurrence for her. It caused a thrill to wash over her, and her heart to tingle to the charm of its allure. The world around her now was not the world of daylight, an alien place full of weird, evasive enchantments. The dim, wide fields laid in silence before her, wrapped in a holy mystery of darkness, while the wind loosened from wild places far away, stealed towards her as it blew over the distant dewy starlit mountains, whistling through the trees and the fragrant alpine meadows, greeting her like an old friend, to caress her face gently with its fresh kisses. She permits the light of the torch to navigate the path ahead of her, and the moonlight pledges to help her in this regard, by showering her path with its silvery infusions. She ambles gracefully through the moist grass, the sound of her boots crunching the undergrowth. It's rather pronounced, as are the crickets and frogs, and the distant hooting of an owl. So they become the beguiling music of the night, offering Emily's growing reticence an urgent encouragement that hastens her speed as she hurries along towards the woodgrove, almost as if she has an appointment to meet that will not accommodate any delay. Even she cannot comprehend her need to hurry. The tall, sultry trees almost welcome her, with open arms, as if whispering into her heart, "What took you so long? We've been waiting for you." Emily had only been between these trees on horseback, but now the forest seemed dauntingly huge, intimidating. The trees like ascending giants with hundreds of jiggling arms, wearing green needles on their sleeves, while the underbrush and the ferns are shaded in the obscurity of the twilight, where they hide in the ambiguous shadows, determined to remain like silent witnesses that are not seen, but observe everything the night might unleash. For the forest holds many dark secrets. Of that Emily is most certain. Emily is surprised to find she's thoroughly enjoying her walk. It's so unnatural for her in every regard, and the curiosity the stoic night presents intrigues her greatly. That is when she hears a strange chattering sound. She stops dead in her path, becoming as still as the trunk of a tree, listening to the words that tumble on the wind. They seem airy, remote, but there's no familiar American drawl to the tone. Emily had no consideration for her safety as her inquisitive nature draws her closer and closer and closer to the chatter. She knew if Crow were here, with her now, he too would exercise no reluctance, for both of them are people driven by their curiosity, at the expense of all else. She surreptitiously switches off her torch, relying only on the gentle trajectory of moonlight that peppers the forest in an ethereal illumination. Then she sees them, the silhouettes of two human beings. But no, this cannot be. She is perturbed, for the taller one is easily 8 foot tall, the smaller one about 5 foot. The gait is so human. They look to be wearing shaggy coats, or as Emily would put it, rug-like onesies, which for a warm summer's night is nonsensical, terribly impractical. Who could be cold on a night like this, when only the breeze is cool, but the night itself is very warm? The taller being is speaking in a peculiar language that has its origins in ancient dialects that have long since grown extinct. The soft tone of her voice is obviously female. It's direct, charged with a reprimanding condemnation, as if she's giving the smaller being a reproachful scolding of note. Emily moves closer. She knows she's an impostor, most likely an unwelcome, uninvited intruder. But her prudent vigilance and savvy common sense have been blown far, far away, with the winds over the foothills and above the mountains. She ambles closer. She realizes that the beings are not wearing coats after all, but are covered in long flowing hair attached to their bodies. The large female being is demanding for the smaller one to open up its hands, as it's kept its fingers tightly clenched together. as if it's hiding something. Emily realises that the 5-foot creature doesn't want to show the female what it's hiding. She guesses it must be the female creature's son. With a wary reluctance, it finally opens its hands, very, very slowly, and the large 8-foot hairy lady examines the prize. It's a long piece of green glass. The female grows angry. She's pointing indignantly at the glass, possibly broken off from a bottle somewhere. She's explaining how dangerous it is. She scrapes a bit of the glass over the back of her hand to demonstrate this point, and the hairy boy is alarmed when the female's hand begins to bleed. The small creature begins to apologise when he realises that what he's playing with was a treacherous implement of some kind. He hangs his head in shame, looking exceedingly bashful. It is in that moment that the female hairy lady begins to realise that they are not alone. She looks rather startled, as if she's been caught naked in the shower, and has suddenly become very self-conscious. Both heads swivel around to stare at Emily in astonishment, as if she was the last person they were expecting to see. Their mouths almost drop open in surprise, and Emily becomes conscious of her impertinence. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to intrude," she says suddenly, aware of how enormous these human beings are compared to her, and conscious of her own vulnerability. They're so enormous. Should she be afraid? The female says something to her son, and obediently he rushes into the woods and is gone. Emily watches the female digging up the soil and burying the offending piece of glass beneath the ground so that it's safely out of her son's reach. Emily, instead of walking away, remains rooted to the spot, her fascination all-consuming. Emily, instead of walking away, remains rooted to the spot, her fascination all-consuming. I mean, these idiosyncratic creatures look like pictures she'd seen in her classroom as a schoolgirl, depicting early man. The female rises to her feet after she's finally buried the glass. "Who are you?" asks Emily directly, staring into the kind dark eyes of the creature. She speaks back to her in a strange language, and to Emily's amazement, the words are eloquently translated in her head. "Intopa sinapolono, inalino golomon." More to the point, who are you? "Amasidabo. I saw you this morning on horseback, riding through my woodgrove with the boys." "I'm related to them," says Emily. "What do you mean, your woodgrove? My cousins own this property." "Isipolanisa uzuvonina." "I think you will find they think they own this property," says the creature. She looks at Emily with kindly dark eyes. "Mupolanina dopo, isan topolene." "It's good to have another female around," she says. "Godspeed," and then she just glides away and disappears from sight. "Wait! Wait! Please wait!" calls Emily after her. "Wait!" But the creature has just gone. She's so disappointed. The next morning, Emily was champing at the bit to tell her cousins what she'd seen in the woodgrove. "You went out into the woods at night?" asked Joseph scoldingly. "It's not safe, you know. There are wild animals around. Why would you do a thing like that?" Emily ignored his scolding. "I saw 2 Neanderthals," she said. "I couldn't believe it myself, but they clearly aren't all extinct. The female, she was so nice. She spoke to me in an ancient language." "Sorry, Emily. What the hell are you talking about? You're not making any sense." "You know, early man. They had hair all over their bodies. Well, I saw 2 Neanderthal in the woods last night. I'm not making this up, you know." "I think our cousin might just have seen a Bigfoot," says Harry suddenly. He immediately taps into his cell phone and shows her footage of a Bigfoot seen in Bluff Creek in 1966. "Did it look like this?" he asked. Emily studies the picture. "No, not really. Much, much more human. Bigger. More athletic. A lot more hair. The breast on this female was not so saggy, but the arms were equally as long, I have to say." "It's official," says Harry. "You saw a Bigfoot. You weren't scared then?" "No, not really. Much more curious than scared." "Bloody hell," says Harry, looking heartily disappointed. "We've lived here all our lives and we've never seen a Bigfoot.
but you on your second week encounter one. It's not fair.
1 week later, Emily sees her father climbing out of the taxi. She knows what she's done is naughty, but it just can't be helped. Her father reluctantly knocks on the front door of the farmhouse. Emily can see he's looking furtively around him, as if he'd rather be anywhere else in the world than back here in Colorado, where he'd lived as a young boy. But he knocks on the door again.
"Go and get the door, Dad," says Harry, who was also in on the whole plan that Emily had conjured up. Harry watches his father walking reluctantly to the front door. "Who could be at the farmhouse at this time of the evening?" he says. He opens the door to see his brother standing there. The two men look so uncannily alike, so there was no mistaking who he was. Both men stare at each other disbelievingly, as if they're caught up in some kind of alternative reality. "Paul!" says Theo, throwing his arms around his brother. "I thought this day would never happen. It's wonderful to see you." Both the men embrace warmly. "I don't understand," says my father. "You look all right to me. Emily told me you were dying of cancer. You had a day or so left to live, and that I had to come at once." "So she told you that?" said Emily's uncle, looking nonplussed. "I hasten to say I do not have cancer. I'm absolutely fine. Never been better, in fact." "Sorry, Dad," says Emily, hurrying to greet her dad. "Look at you. You came to make your peace with your brother when you thought he was about to die. So why don't you make it up with him now while he's alive? While you're both alive? This terrible, terrible dispute you've had together for so long is crazy. It has to end now." "So this was a set-up then, was it?" "I'm afraid so," says Harry. "It was Emily's idea. We know about the kidney transplant and how the family fell out. It's time that we drew a line under the sand and moved forward into the future." To cut a long story short, Emily's father and brother have now become the very best of friends, and many happy holidays are spent with the family in the Colorado countryside. So it would seem that against all odds, miracles can happen. And Emily also considers her encounter with the Bigfoots to be another one. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, what an incredible story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.